Before a Viking could become a legendary explorer, he first had to survive winter. Every autumn, as the days grew shorter and the first frost crept across Scandinavia, an invisible countdown began. The grass stopped growing, the fields hardened, and every farmer knew exactly what was coming. There wasn't enough hay, not even close. Keeping every sheep, goat, and cow alive through the winter was mathematically impossible. Every animal they kept alive through winter meant another mouth competing for the same pile of hay. For many families, choosing which animals lived meant deciding which ones would feed their children. So each year, families faced a brutal decision, not because they wanted to, but because nature left them no choice. Within days, much of their livestock had to be slaughtered. Across the north, villages suddenly found themselves surrounded by mountains of fresh meat. For a brief moment, it looked like unimaginable abundance. In reality, it was a race against time. Fresh meat doesn't wait. Every passing hour gives bacteria another chance to multiply. Leave it too long, and the same food that could save an entire family becomes deadly. Ancient civilizations had already discovered a solution: salt. Pack meat in enough salt, and something remarkable happens. The salt pulls water out of bacterial cells. Without water, they can't grow. They can't reproduce, and eventually they die. Simple, effective. For most of the ancient world, salt was the answer, which is why historians long assumed the Vikings preserved their food the same way. It makes perfect sense, except they couldn't. Scandinavia wasn't the Mediterranean. The cold northern climate couldn't produce vast natural salt beds under the sun. Making sea salt meant boiling enormous amounts of seawater over open fires. To produce just a small amount of usable salt required an astonishing amount of firewood, wood that families desperately needed to heat their homes, build their longships, and survive the winter itself. For ordinary Viking farmers, preserving thousands of kilograms of meat with salt wasn't practical. It was a luxury one few could afford. So the greatest survival challenge of the Viking Age wasn't how to find food. It was how to stop it from disappearing. Because somewhere between the autumn slaughter and the first ship sailing in spring, the Vikings discovered something that changed everything. And strangely enough, their first step didn't come from salt at all. It came from the sea. The Vikings couldn't make enough salt, so they looked somewhere no one else did: the ocean. Every storm washed enormous piles of kelp and seaweed onto the rocky shores of Scandinavia. To most people, it was nothing more than rotting plants. To the Vikings, it became the first piece of the puzzle. They dried the seaweed, burned it slowly, and collected the dark mineral-rich ash that remained. It wasn't as powerful as pure salt, but it was enough to buy them something priceless: time. The ash slowed spoilage just long enough for the next step, because the real preservation didn't happen in a barrel. It happened in the wind. High above the crashing Atlantic, Viking communities built simple wooden drying racks on exposed coastal cliffs. No walls, no fireplaces, no protection from the freezing air. That was the point. Day after day, week after week, powerful Arctic winds swept across the hanging meat and fish, not cooking them, not freezing them solid, but quietly pulling moisture out of every fiber. Bacteria can survive almost anywhere, except somewhere with almost no water. As the food dried, the invisible armies of decay simply stopped growing. By the end of winter, what had once been fresh fish had transformed into something astonishing: hardfisker. So dry, so dense, that it could survive for years. There was just one problem: eating it was almost as difficult as preserving it. The fish became so hard that Viking sailors often had to smash it apart with rocks or wooden mallets before they could chew it. Every bite reminded them of home. Every bite also reminded them that if this food failed, they would never see home again. It wasn't delicious. It wasn't comfortable. It was survival, and for a while, it worked. But nature always finds another way to challenge you. Everything changed when the ships left the icy fjords. The further south they sailed, the warmer the air became. The wetter the winds became, and the enemy returned: moisture. The same moisture that bacteria had been waiting for. Suddenly, wind drying was no longer enough. The Vikings had solved one problem, only to discover an even bigger one. How do you protect food inside the damp, crowded hull of a ship for years? The answer wouldn't come from the wind. It would come from smoke. The ocean winds had bought the Vikings time, but time wasn't enough. The moment their ship sailed into warmer, wetter climates, everything changed. Moisture crept back into their food. Mold returned. Rot returned. The enemy they thought they'd defeated was waiting. The Vikings needed something stronger than cold air, something that could travel with them. So they turned to fire, not blazing flames, not roaring bonfires, slow, smoldering, almost invisible fires. Inside low wooden smokehouses, strips of meat hung silently from the rafters. Below them, green birch logs, damp peat, and fragrant juniper burned so slowly that they produced almost no heat. Only smoke. Day after day, the thick white clouds wrapped themselves around every piece of meat. The Vikings weren't trying to cook it. They were building a shield. Every hour, the smoke coated the surface with natural compounds that bacteria hated. It slowed spoilage, protected the fat from turning rancid, and made it far harder for insects and mold to take hold. For the first time, their food could survive not just the winter, but the journey beyond it. Then came the second layer of protection. When the smoking was finished, the meat disappeared underground. Hidden beneath thick layers of turf and stone, Viking storage vaults stayed remarkably cool throughout the year. No sunlight, no sudden swings in temperature, no easy way for decay to spread. The earth itself became a refrigerator centuries before refrigeration existed. It was an elegant system: wind, smoke, cold earth. Together, they allowed Viking communities to preserve enormous amounts of food for months. It sounds like the perfect solution, but it wasn't, because one kind of food still refused to cooperate: fresh, fatty red meat. The very food that gave rowing crews the energy they needed was also the hardest to preserve. Smoke could protect its surface. Cold earth could slow decay while it stayed on land. But once those barrels were loaded into a crowded longship, crossing warmer seas, under constant movement, everything changed. The greatest preservation system the Vikings had ever built still wasn't enough. So they abandoned salt. They pushed beyond smoke. And they discovered something so strange that even today, most people would never think of using it: a cloudy liquid left over after making cheese. But proving that idea wasn't easy. The clues weren't written in Viking sagas. They were buried beneath the ground. Across Scandinavia and Iceland, archaeologists uncovered smokehouses, drying racks, food processing sites, and heavy wooden barrels that hinted at a far more sophisticated preservation system than anyone had imagined. Piece by piece, the evidence began to fit together. But one mystery refused to disappear. What exactly had those barrels been carrying? For generations, historians believed they already had the answer: salt, smoke. Problem solved, except it wasn't. Those methods explained dried fish. They explained smoked meat. But they couldn't explain something archaeologists kept finding again and again: heavy wooden barrels, sealed tightly, built to survive years at sea. If the Vikings had already dried or smoked everything, why carry hundreds of kilograms of liquid across the North Atlantic? It made no sense. Until researchers realized the liquid wasn't there to accompany the meat. It was the preservation, not oil, not brine, not alcohol. Something far stranger. Every summer, Viking farms transformed fresh sheep's milk into thick, protein-rich scare. Once the cheese was made, a pale, cloudy liquid remained. Most people today would pour it away without a second thought. The Vikings never did. They saved every drop, stored it in great oak vats. Then, they waited. As the weeks passed, naturally occurring bacteria quietly transformed the leftover whey. It grew sharper, more acidic, more hostile to anything that caused food to spoil. The Vikings called it Sýra, and then they did something almost unbelievable. They took fresh, uncooked, red meat and lowered it directly into barrels filled with the fermented liquid. No fire, no drying, no salt, just raw meat, completely submerged. To anyone watching, it would have looked like they were ruining perfectly good food. They were actually saving it. As the acidity increased, the barrel became an environment where the dangerous microbes responsible for spoilage could no longer thrive. Decay slowed dramatically. The meat remained protected, not because it had been cooked, not because it had been frozen, but because the barrel itself had become a biological fortress. Those barrels weren't just cargo. For every man on that ship, they were the difference between returning home and becoming another skeleton beneath the Atlantic. Suddenly, everything made sense. Those mysterious barrels weren't carrying supplies. They were the technology. A Viking longship didn't just transport food across the ocean. It carried a living preservation system, one that allowed raw meat to survive voyages that should have been impossible. Of course, there was a price. Meat preserved in fermented Sýra didn't taste fresh. It became noticeably sour, with a sharp flavor that many people today would probably find unpleasant. Before eating, it was often rinsed, sometimes soaked, and usually cooked into hearty meals. But to a Viking sailor, taste was never the priority. Survival was. Now the entire picture comes into focus. The Vikings didn't rely on a single miracle technique. They built an entire survival system. Every method solved a different problem. Every barrel had a different purpose. Every journey depended on all of them working together. Along the freezing coastlines of Scandinavia, lean fish hung for months in relentless Arctic winds, slowly losing the moisture that bacteria needed to survive. Hard, lightweight, capable of lasting for years. Fatty cuts of pork and game followed a different path. They were coated with mineral-rich seaweed ash, smoked for weeks over slow-burning fires, then hidden inside cool underground turf vaults, where the earth itself protected them from heat and decay. But the most valuable food of all, fresh red meat, required something entirely different. It was packed into heavy oak barrels, completely submerged beneath fermented Sýra, and sealed away for voyages that could carry Viking ships far beyond the edge of the known world. Every preservation method had one job. Together, they became something far more powerful than food storage. They became freedom. Freedom from harvest seasons, freedom from local hunting grounds, freedom from fragile supply lines that forced other civilizations to stay close to home. A Viking longship no longer sailed with just warriors. It sailed with an entire ecosystem of survival built into its hull. That's what made their voyages possible. Not stronger ships, not bigger armies, not better swords. A better way to keep food alive. Because the greatest obstacle between Scandinavia and distant horizons was never the ocean. It was always the question hiding beneath the deck. Would the food survive? Once the Vikings answered that question, the Atlantic became a road instead of a barrier. Perhaps the most surprising part is that this knowledge never completely disappeared. In Iceland today, harðfiskar is still eaten. Skyr is still one of the country's best-known traditional foods. Modern refrigerators have replaced smokehouses. Factories have replaced drying racks. But 1,000 years later, echoes of Viking survival can still be found on the dinner table. Imagine standing on the deck of a Viking longship as it disappears beyond the horizon. The waves grow larger. The coastline fades into the mist. Weeks become months. Months become years. There are no ports waiting ahead. No supply ships, no rescue if something goes wrong. Everything the crew needs to survive is already beneath their feet. Not gold, not weapons, not treasure. Food. Food that refused to rot. Every time a Viking ship disappeared beyond the horizon, someone was waiting for it to come home. Parents, wives, children. Whether it ever did, often depended on the barrels hidden beneath the deck. Because somewhere, long before those sails ever caught the wind, someone had solved a problem that almost no history book talks about. How do you keep life alive when the world is trying to take it away? The answer wasn't a revolutionary weapon. It wasn't a new kind of ship. It wasn't even a famous king. It was a series of quiet discoveries. The drying wind from the Atlantic, the smoke of slow-burning fires, the cool darkness beneath the earth, and finally, a forgotten barrel filled with fermented Sýra. Individually, none of these ideas changed history. Together, they changed the limits of where humans could go. Without them, Viking ships might never have reached Iceland, Greenland might never have been settled, and the shores of North America might have remained unseen by Europeans for centuries longer. When we tell the story of great civilizations, we usually celebrate the people who fought the battles, the kings, the explorers, the conquerors. But history doesn't belong only to those who carried the sword. It also belongs to the people who quietly solved impossible problems. The people who found a way to carry tomorrow's meal across an unforgiving ocean. Because in the end, the Vikings didn't conquer the Atlantic because they were fearless. They conquered it because their food survived the journey.